In this lecture, we're going to get into a really important part of muscle function, and that is energy. ATP is what our body uses, and life uses, I should say, but our body, which is living, also uses as our energy source, adenosine triphosphate. And you learned all about this in your biology class. And the way it works, essentially, is there is a molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate, excuse me, and it's an adenine, a ribose, which is the sugar, and then there's 3 phosphates attached to it. And hopefully you remember back to biology class, energy is essentially stored in those bonds. Now, it's not like there's energy is actually stored in there, but by losing a phosphate and by gaining a phosphate, that provides a system the ability to do something. And that's oxidating or reducing a reaction of some kind. So am I going to go into all this stuff about ATP? No, I'm not. I'm not going to get into the biology of it. What I want us to understand, though, is how it relates to muscle function. And we need to always be making ATP. If you go back to earlier in this unit, I talked about how a sarcomere works. And what happens is these little myosin heads have to attach to the actin and pull that actin forward. And what I said was each time those myosin heads move, it takes one ATP to bring that myosin head up to the actin fiber and pull it forward in what is called the power stroke. And then it takes a second ATP molecule to allow that myosin head to detach and go back to that original position. And then that continues. So as long as ATP is present and calcium is attached to the troponin, that molecule of that muscle, I should say, will stay contracted. It will continue to contract until you remove the calcium or until you run out of ATP. So what does that mean? That means we always have to be making ATP. We have very little ATP in our system at any time. We have to make it constantly. And how do we make ATP? Well, that's what we're going to talk about now. There's several ways to do it. So let's jump into this. So ATP, as I said, is essentially this molecule. And it's a molecule that provides the energy for muscle contractions and every other process in a living organism. That is our energy source, ATP. And what happens is ATP gets converted to ADP, or adenosine diphosphate, by losing a phosphate. So that bond is broken, and when that bond is broken, energy is available to that system to do something. And usually it involves moving of a protein. That's essentially what happens. It might open a channel in a in a membrane, but in this case we're talking about a muscle contraction. So this is just another image that makes that point. In order for you to have energy to use, you need to make more ATP. And the way you do that is you add a phosphate to an ADP molecule. So essentially there's this process going on inside of our cells where ATP is being converted to ADP when you use energy. And then in order to have more available energy, an ADP, adenosine diphosphate molecule, is converted back to an ATP molecule by simply adding a phosphate. Now I'm saying simply adding a phosphate, but it's a little more complicated than that. So how do we do this? How do we make this happen? Well, there's several avenues. And the one that you learned about was cell respiration, right? You learned about that in biology class. In your mitochondria, you're go through this long process with the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. And the final product at the end are going to be ATP molecules. And if you remember back to biology class, one glucose molecule will net you, depending on who you're talking to, there's a couple different numbers that are attached to that, 36 ATP. You can argue 38, you can argue 34. There's a bunch of different ideas about that. But 36 is usually what I go with. But some resources will say 38 because there's a couple different avenues that you can get into with that. But here's the problem. We use our muscles a lot. And as you know, if you use your muscles vigorously, you can run out of energy very quickly. So if you're just sitting in your chair right now, you're not using a whole lot of energy in your muscles. You're still using a lot because you're keeping your body warm and you're moving around and you're supporting your spine, and you're holding your head up. But in terms of vigorous exercise, then you need some other sources. And the first source we're going to talk about is something called creatine phosphate. Now, you may be familiar with creatine. Some of you might even take creatine as a supplement. You can go buy it at like a health store or go to GNC and buy creatine. It does work. It is an effective tool for helping you exercise at your peak. And I'll explain how that happens in today's lecture. So what is creatine phosphate? Well, it's a molecule. And let's get into it. So basically, what creatine phosphate is it's a creatine molecule, and it's actually produced by your liver. So your liver makes creatine. It's a protein. and it holds on to a phosphate, and it's relatively small, and it's stored in your muscles. So it'll be made in your liver, it'll travel through your system, and it accumulates in your muscle fibers. So in the, imagine the sarcomere, imagine this muscle. In that muscle, there's other things going on, right? It's not just actin, it's not just myosin. There's other components to a muscle, and one of those components is going to be this creatine. So what it can do is actually, in a pinch, if you need it, it can provide a phosphate to convert ADP back to ATP when you need it. So how does that happen? Well, basically what ends up happening is creatine can hold on to a phosphate, and when you need it, it can supply it to an ADP molecule to allow it to function. And then when you have a lot of ATP in your system, your ATP will actually donate a phosphate to creatine and hold on to it. So think of creatine as a friend that is going to hold on to some money for you for when you need it. So imagine I was a little flush right now. I had a lot of extra money. I made a little extra paycheck this week. I might say, hey, can you do me a favor? Hold on to this money for me. And, if I need it towards the end of the week, my rent's due or whatever, and I run out of money, I'm going to ask you for that money back. That's essentially what's happening here. So I made this little image here, which is not that exciting, but you'll get the point. So let's say this is an ATP molecule. Now, let's say I have a lot of ATP. I'm not doing a whole lot active. What's going to happen is my body's going to recognize that fact, and it's going to, there's a process that goes on that causes that ATP to donate its phosphate to creatine. And now that ATP molecule is going to have to go get, another phosphate somewhere else. But ideally, when you're at rest, your body's going through the normal process of cell respiration. So you have plenty of ATP. So it's not a problem, right? And then when you need that creatine, that phosphate, let's say you're doing some vigorous exercise and you need that extra phosphate because your ATP is being used up, that creatine that's holding on to the phosphate is going to donate it back to that ADP molecule, and now you have an ATP molecule that can be used. So think of it as just extra energy in your muscles that can be used. It's storing it there. It's holding it there for when you need it. Remember, we did not evolve to play football. We evolved to run away from animals. Being the top of the food chain is relatively new for humans. We have not been at the top of the food chain for that long. There was a long time in the history of humans where we were like somewhere towards the top, but we were definitely not at the top. We had to run after animals to hunt them, and we had to run from animals to not get eaten. So having a store of energy might get you that extra 100 yards to get away from that tiger that's chasing you and get you to safety. So we have these things that are built into our system, so when we're in a dangerous situation, we can get out of it. We take advantage of that, though, and we lift weights and get big and strong. And that's what creatine can do. Now, you can buy creatine as a supplement. They sell it at the store, and it works. Now, you can overdo it. I'm actually going to have you do an assignment where you just look a little bit more into how creatine works. But overall, just think of it as a storage for extra phosphate in your muscles, and that creatine sits in there, and your liver produces it, and when you have excess, your liver breaks it down, which is why if you take too much creatine, it can actually cause liver damage. So if you can't overdo it. But what it does is it doesn't make you stronger. It gives you a little extra energy. So just in terms of the gym, working out, people have a misconception with creatine. They think it makes you stronger. It does not make you stronger. It provides you with a little more energy to get an extra set or two out. So let's say you normally lift 8 reps of something. If you take creatine, you might have the energy to get a 9th and a 10th rep in. And then obviously, if you continue that process, you will build muscle. We're going to go over one more concept in this lecture, and that is another way that our muscles can get access to usable energy when we're running out, and that is called myoglobin. And that might sound a little familiar to you because you're probably familiar with hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein found in your red blood cells, and hemoglobin has one job. Its job is to carry oxygen. So your blood is full of these things called red blood cells, and each red blood cell is full of these things, these proteins called hemoglobin. There's actually 270 million hemoglobin molecules in one red blood cell. So those red blood cells are really good at carrying oxygen. Down here I have a picture of hemoglobin. And as you can see, it's a very complex molecule. And there's 4 spots on the hemoglobin molecule that can hold oxygen. So each hemoglobin molecule can hold 4 oxygen. So if there's 270 million, you can imagine red blood cells can carry a lot of oxygen. This little guy here is a myoglobin. So I just wanted to have that picture there so you can see a reference. Myoglobin is much smaller and it can hold 1 oxygen. So this is not a superior molecule to hemoglobin. It is there if you need it. And it's small so it fits in your muscle. So you can fit a lot of myoglobin into your muscle. So what is it? Basically, it's a little protein that can hold on to extra oxygen for you. So think of it as like a little oxygen storage area. So normally during muscle usage, hopefully remember back to biology. I'm going to talk more about this in a little bit. When there's not oxygen available, you go through a process called fermentation or lactic acid fermentation. And in that process, your muscle can produce 2 ATP, not 36, just 2. And that might give you the energy that you need. But as you hopefully remember, it does build up acid in the muscle, that lactic acid. It leads to burning. So if you've ever worked out before and you've done a lot of reps and you feel a burning sensation in your muscle, what that means is you've used up all the available oxygen in the muscle and you've now switched to lactic acid fermentation. And that is available to you. But before that happens, that's where myoglobin comes in. So myoglobin is there to provide some extra oxygen to allow this process to occur. So it just gives your cells a little more oxygen to go through the process of cell respiration and keep your body running. Now, one thing I will say about it is hemoglobin is what makes your blood red. Myoglobin is what makes your muscles red. So for example, if you've ever seen a piece of steak before or any kind of red meat, the red color that is in that meat is because it has a lot of myoglobin. And those are muscles that are built for sustaining. And we'll talk more about that at the end of this section, the difference between white muscle and red muscle. If you've ever had white meat before, like a piece of chicken versus a piece of steak, the difference is myoglobin and the amount of mitochondria there. And we're going to talk more about that a little bit later. So, just think of myoglobin as basically a storage of oxygen in your muscles. So if you use up that available oxygen, you have a store to go by. And I think that's what I want to get through for this. Yeah, we're going to get into this other stuff in another lecture. Thank you.